The wind was harsh that morning on October 6, 1851, when a baby named William Preston Longley took his first breath in the wild heart of Texas. No one in that small, struggling settlement could have guessed that this crying child would grow up to be one of the most feared names in the Old West, Wild Bill Longley. Texas in those days was not a peaceful land. It was a place between wars, between law and lawlessness. The Civil War had left the South broken and bitter. People were poor, angry, and desperate. There was no promise of safety, no real justice, and very few rules. Men made their own laws, and guns often decided who was right. This was the world Bill Longley was born into, a world that taught him early that survival came first, and mercy came last. Bill was the eldest of 10 children, raised on a hard patch of land near Evergreen, Texas, a town that would later be renamed Lee County. His father, Campbell Longley, worked the fields, trying to feed the family with whatever the land would give. His mother, Sarah Longley, did what mothers did best in those days. She kept everyone alive. The family was strict, religious, and expected obedience, but even as a boy, Bill didn't like being told what to do. He was smart, restless, and quick to anger. He could ride almost as soon as he could walk, and by his teenage years he could shoot straighter than most grown men. Neighbors would later remember that Bill Longley had charm. He could make you laugh one minute and make you nervous the next. He was unpredictable, a storm in human form. The Civil War changed everything. When the fighting ended in 1865, Texas was left bleeding. Union soldiers now patrolled the towns, enforcing laws that many Texans didn't accept. Anger boiled in the hearts of young men who had lost everything. They wanted someone to blame, and violence became their language. Bill was only 14 when the war ended, but he grew up fast in a land filled with hatred and fear. Stories say he began carrying a gun before he could even shave. He watched older boys swagger through town, their pistols shining at their sides, earning respect through fear. And soon he decided that was the kind of respect he wanted too. As a teenager, Bill worked on nearby ranches. He was strong and fearless, always willing to ride hard, rope fast, and fight if he had to. But there was a dark side to him, a pride that couldn't stand being laughed at or challenged. A simple insult could turn into a fist fight, and a fist fight could turn deadly. Those who knew him said that when Bill's eyes went cold, it was already too late. He began to see the gun not just as a tool, but as a solution. Every problem, every argument, every slight, the gun could fix it. And the more he used it, the more powerful he felt. The young Longley also learned something else. Fear made people listen. He liked that. He liked the way men stepped aside when he walked into a saloon. He liked the way people whispered his name. But that hunger for control, for being the man nobody crossed, was the seed of his downfall. By the time he was 17, stories of Wild Bill Longley began to spread through the Texas plains. He hadn't yet killed anyone, but his temper was legend. And in a place where violence was as common as dust, it was only a matter of time. Then came the first killing, or at least the first one people talked about. Some said Bill shot a man for mocking his father. Others said it was over a game of cards. Nobody could agree on what really happened. But one thing was sure. A man was dead, and Bill Longley's name was now stained with blood. Instead of feeling guilt, Bill felt alive. In his mind, he had proven himself. He wasn't just another poor farm boy anymore. He was someone to fear. And that feeling, that twisted sense of pride, would follow him for the rest of his life. Over the next few years, Bill's world grew darker. He drifted from town to town, sometimes working, sometimes stealing, sometimes just passing through. He drank too much, talked too loud, and fought anyone who dared to stand his way. To the law, he was a troublemaker. To the people, he was dangerous. But to himself, he was unstoppable, the hero of his own wild story. The truth is, Bill Longley's legend began long before the killings that made him famous. It began in his heart, a place filled with pride, anger, and a burning need to be noticed. He wasn't born evil. He was born into a world that rewarded violence and laughed at weakness. And he learned that fast hands and a quicker trigger could earn you everything: respect, fear, and fame, at least for a while. As the 1870s dawned, Bill was no longer a boy. He was a man with a gun and a reputation, wandering through the rough towns of Texas where danger was always one wrong look away. Every saloon was a test. Every stranger could be an enemy, and every night might be his last. Somewhere deep down, though, there was still that Texas farm boy, the one who once helped his mother milk cows, who listened to his father's Bible readings, who dreamed of being something more than poor. But that boy was fading fast, swallowed by the legend he was creating. Wild Bill Longley was on his way to becoming one of the most feared and fabled outlaws of the American West. He didn't know it yet, but each step he took, each bullet he fired, was leading him closer to the gallows, to that cold morning in Giddings, Texas, where his story would finally end. But for now, the young Bill rode beneath the blazing Texas sun, his revolver glinting at his side, his pride as loud as thunder. He believed he could outrun fate. He believed no man or law could catch him. And for a time, he was right. This was only the beginning of the legend, the making of Wild Bill Longley, the outlaw who mistook fear for fame. The Texas sun was merciless that summer. The air hung heavy, the kind of heat that made tempers short and men quicker to draw. By now, Bill Longley was no longer the farm boy from Evergreen. He was a young man with a restless spirit, a fast gun, and a taste for trouble. He rode from town to town, drinking, gambling, and daring fate. His smile could charm a saloon full of strangers, but behind that grin was something darker, a need to prove himself again and again, with lead and fire. In those days, Texas was crawling with tension. Reconstruction had left scars on everyone. Union soldiers still patrolled southern towns, trying to enforce new laws that many Texans despised. Hatred simmered between freedmen, Union loyalists, and ex-Confederates. And in that boiling pot of anger, young guns like Bill Longley found their excuse to fight and kill. They didn't need much reason. Sometimes a word, a glance, or even a laugh was enough. And that's how it began, the story that would mark Bill's path forever. It happened near Lexington, Texas, around 1868. Bill was only 17, riding with a few other restless boys. They were loud, cocky, and armed, the kind of youth who thought the world owed them something. That day, they crossed paths with a man, a freed black farmer named Green Evans. Some say Evans had worked for the Longleys before the war. Others said he had insulted Bill. Whatever the truth was, it didn't matter. Bill saw a target, and in the twisted logic of that time, he believed shooting Evans would make him a hero to the wrong kind of people. He raised his gun. A flash, a single shot, and just like that, a life ended, and an outlaw was born. For a moment, the world went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The other boys looked at Bill, not with admiration, but shock. He had crossed a line that most never dared to cross. But instead of guilt, Bill Longley felt a rush, a wild thrill that set his heart racing. He laughed, spun his pistol, and rode off, the echo of his gun still hanging in the air behind him. That laughter would follow him for years, haunting him, feeding his legend. From that day on, Bill's life changed. He couldn't go home. He couldn't turn back. He had tasted blood and fear and found them intoxicating. The newspapers started whispering his name. Bill Longley, the Texas killer. It wasn't true yet, not completely, but soon it would be. He began to roam the Texas backcountry, moving from town to town. He rode through Milam County, Caldwell, and Bastrop, sometimes finding work, sometimes stealing horses, sometimes just vanishing into the hills. The people who met him never forgot him. He could be friendly and charming one minute, cold and dangerous the next. A friend today, a killer tomorrow. That was Wild Bill. But beneath that swagger, Bill was still young, too young. He was chasing something he didn't understand. He wanted power, respect, maybe even to be feared like the famous gunfighters he'd heard about in saloon tales. He began to believe his own myth, that he was born for danger, that the world owed him a place among the legends of the frontier, and so he kept pushing his luck. There were more shootings. Some were quick, forgotten brawls. Others were cruel, senseless killings. He shot a preacher once, just because he thought the man had insulted him. Another time he gunned down a Mexican cowboy over a horse. The details blurred together, part truth, part brag. Even Bill began to lose track of how many men had died by his hand. When the whiskey flowed, he'd boast that he had killed 32 men. But most historians today believe it was closer to 8, maybe less. Still, in a time when rumors traveled faster than facts, the legend grew. Every story added another body, another escape, another wild fight in the moonlight, and Bill didn't mind. He liked the sound of it, the name that made lawmen restless and women curious. Wild Bill Longley. It rolled off the tongue like a warning. But legends don't pay bills. Bill still had to survive, and that meant stealing horses, robbing travelers, and drifting deeper into outlaw life. Sometimes he'd hide out with friends. Other times he'd vanish into the piney woods, living off the land. When things got too hot, he joined up with other drifters, small gangs of thieves and killers who roamed central Texas. Each new group brought more bloodshed, and each crime made him harder to forgive. In 1870, he joined the U.S. Army for a brief time, thinking he could hide behind a uniform. But Bill Longley and discipline were oil and water. He picked fights with other soldiers, mouthed off to his officers, and deserted not long after. Even in the Army, the wildness wouldn't die. He wasn't built for rules. He was built for chaos. Everywhere he went, he left a trail, not just of crimes, but of stories. Some people feared him. Others admired him, seeing him as a rebel against Northern authority. To some, he was a symbol of Southern defiance. To others, just a cold-blooded killer. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Bill Longley was a young man who didn't know how to stop fighting, with the world, with others, and most of all, with himself. As the years passed, his reputation exploded. Songs were whispered about him. Tales were told in campfires and saloons, half true, half fantasy. Some said he could shoot the wings off a fly. Others claimed he could outdraw any man alive. Bill loved it all. He didn't care if the stories were true, as long as they made him larger than life. He once told a bartender, "If they're going to talk about me, they might as well talk big." That line stuck, and so did his name. But beneath the legend, trouble was closing in. The Texas Rangers were growing tired of hearing his name. Sheriffs wanted his head and old enemies wanted revenge. Soon, every ride, every town, every stranger's stare could mean death or capture. And Bill, for all his bragging, began to feel it. That shadow following close behind. He had become what he wanted, a famous outlaw. But fame in the Old West had a short lifespan, and Bill Longley's days of running free were already numbered. By the early 1870s, Wild Bill Longley was a name everyone in Texas knew. To some, he was a hero, a rebel who refused to bow to the new order. To others, he was nothing but a cold-blooded killer. But to the law, he was something worse, a problem that couldn't be ignored anymore. Texas was changing. The wild years after the Civil War were fading. Railroads were coming, towns were growing, and the Texas Rangers were rebuilding their ranks. The Rangers were no longer scattered or broken. They were organized, determined, and hungry to clean up the state's name. And one of the first names on their list was Bill Longley. Bill was only in his early 20s, but he had already lived a dozen lives. He had killed, escaped, and vanished more times than the newspapers could count. Rumors said he'd been shot dead once already, only to rise again in another county. The myth of Wild Bill was larger than life, and that made him even more dangerous. Every time a man was found dead in a Texas town, people whispered, "Was it Longley?" Most times it wasn't, but fear doesn't need facts. It needs a name. And Bill's name was enough. For a while, he managed to stay ahead of the law. He was clever. He changed names, grew beards, rode under false flags, and blended in with drifters and soldiers. He even tried to hide behind the Army uniform again, this time in Louisiana, where he enlisted under an alias. But Wild Bill couldn't fake obedience for long. He fought with his sergeant, went absent without leave, and ended up in the stockade. He escaped, again, before the Army could hang him for desertion. That escape would become one of many, but it also marked him as a man who could never stop running. Back in Texas, the Rangers were watching. They had informants in every county, men who traded gossip for gold. Longley's trail was faint, a rumor here, a gunshot there, but the Rangers followed every whisper. They knew he liked Lee County, where he'd grown up. They knew he still had friends who would hide him, and enemies who would point the gun if they saw him. And so they waited, patient, quiet, and deadly. Meanwhile, Bill's temper was catching up with him. He had become reckless, drinking too much, bragging too loud, and trusting the wrong people. He was convinced that no one could touch him, not the law, not fate. But fate doesn't warn you before it strikes. In 1875, the spark came, a murder that even his friends couldn't defend. The victim was Wilson Anderson, a man Bill had known for years. Some said they had been friends once. Others said it was revenge for an old family insult. Whatever it was, the shot that killed Anderson sealed Bill Longley's fate. For months, Bill ran. He moved through the back roads of Texas, sleeping under the stars, living off stolen food and fear. The Rangers chased him from Bastrop County to Navasota, from Milam to Bell County. He'd vanish into the trees one day and appear in a saloon 2 towns away the next. Each time they thought they had him, he slipped through their fingers. But the noose was tightening. By 1877, Bill was tired. He was still young, but the running had aged him. He had become jumpy, paranoid, looking over his shoulder at every sound. The fun was gone. The legend that once thrilled him now felt like a cage. Every campfire, every crack of a twig made him reach for his gun. And every time he looked into the mirror, he saw a man the world called a monster. He laughed at that, but deep down he wondered if it was true. The end came quietly, almost unexpectedly. It wasn't a gunfight in the street, or a dramatic standoff like the dime novels promised. It was a trick, played by men who were tired of being hunted. In the summer of 1877, Bill was hiding in DeSoto Parish, Louisiana, using a false name, Bill Jackson. He thought he'd left Texas trouble behind. But the Rangers hadn't forgotten. They had tracked rumors, followed letters, and traced his footsteps all the way to Louisiana. With the help of local sheriffs, they surrounded the farmhouse where Bill was staying. When the lawman kicked the door open, Bill reached for his pistol, but he hesitated. He saw the rifles aimed at his chest, the badges flashing in the lamplight, and for the first time in his life, he didn't pull the trigger. He dropped his gun. For once, Wild Bill surrendered. The Rangers wasted no time. They shackled his wrists, loaded him into a wagon, and began the long ride back to Texas. All along the trail, people came out to see the famous outlaw. Some jeered, some stared in silence, others whispered prayers. Bill just smirked, pretending not to care. But his eyes told another story, the fear of a man who knew the game was over. In Giddings, Texas, the courthouse stood ready. The same town where Bill had once swaggered through saloons was now the place where he'd face his reckoning. The trial was set, and the people were hungry for justice. The newspapers called it the fall of Wild Bill Longley. And for the first time, the legend that had once made him untouchable became his curse. Every witness, every juror, every lawman already knew his name and his story. He wasn't just a criminal anymore. He was a symbol of all the violence Texas wanted to forget. Behind bars, Bill tried to act brave. He told guards he'd escape again. He bragged that the ropes couldn't hold him. But in the quiet nights when no one was listening, he sat alone and staring at the walls, lost in memories of dusty roads, gun smoke, and the laughter that used to make him feel alive. He was only 26 years old, but his life had already run its course. The gallows waited. The morning sun rose slowly over Giddings, Texas, painting the small town in gold. The streets were quiet, but behind those closed doors, people were talking. The outlaw they had feared for years, Wild Bill Longley, was back. But this time, he wasn't riding a horse or holding a gun. He was sitting in a cell waiting for his trial. The courtroom was crowded on the day it began. Men filled the benches, whispering about the killer who had finally been caught. Women peeked through the windows, clutching their shawls, eager to see the man whose name had haunted the county for a decade. The legend had become a man again. Young, thin, pale, and tired. Bill looked different now. The once proud gunfighter sat quiet, his face hardened but his eyes restless. He had faced bullets, ambushes, and manhunts, but this time was different. This time the enemy wasn't holding a gun. It was the law, and the law doesn't miss. The charge was clear: murder. The victim and Wilson Anderson, a man from Bill's own past. The story, like most things around Longley, was tangled. Some said Anderson had insulted his family. Others said it was about jealousy or pride. But none of that mattered. A man was dead, and the evidence was strong. Witnesses came forward, their voices shaking but firm. They spoke of the shot, the chase, the fear. The jury listened in silence. Bill, always known for his quick tongue, said little this time. He only stared at the floor, tapping his boot against the wooden boards. Outside the courthouse, the legend grew louder. Newspapers called him the bloodiest gunman in Texas. Dime novels were already being printed, telling wild tales about his dozens of kills and his charmed life. But inside, Bill Longley was just another man facing the end. The jury didn't take long. When they returned, the air in the courtroom was so still you could hear a fly buzz. "Guilty," the foreman said. And just like that, the story of Wild Bill Longley took its final turn. The sentence, death by hanging. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Bill stood up slowly. His chains clinked as he moved. He looked around the room, at the faces of people who once feared him, at the lawmen who had chased him, at the curious townsfolk who came to watch. And then he smiled. That same half-smile that had once charmed and terrified in equal measure. He said quietly, "Gentlemen, I've been a fool. I've done wrong, and I know I must pay for it. But I want you to remember, I never killed for the joy of killing. I killed because I was proud, and I thought I had to prove something. Now I see I proved nothing." The room stayed silent. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just watched as the once feared Wild Bill Longley sat down again. Not as a killer, but as a man finally out of fight. Days turned into weeks. Bill waited in his cell, sometimes talking to the guards, sometimes humming old campfire songs. He wrote letters, to his parents, to a preacher, even to a few old friends. Some said he asked for forgiveness. Others said he still joked that he might find a way to slip the rope. He was known for escaping before, and people wondered, would he do it again? But not this time. Bill seemed tired, like a man who'd finally made peace with his own story. On October 11th, 1878, the morning of the hanging arrived. The air was cool, the sky clear. A crowd gathered early. Farmers, merchants, soldiers, even children, all there to see the famous outlaw meet his end. The gallows stood tall in the center of Giddings, a wooden stage built for one last performance. Bill was led out under guard. He wore plain clothes, his hands tied, his hair combed neatly. Some said he looked calm. Others swore his lips trembled when he saw the noose swinging in the breeze. As he climbed the steps, he looked out over the crowd. Thousands of faces staring, waiting. The sheriff asked if he had any final words. Bill took a deep breath and said, "I have played my part, and now it's over. I die without fear. May God forgive me for what I've done." Then he paused, looked at the horizon, and whispered, "I was born for trouble. In trouble's where I'll die," the preacher prayed. The crowd fell silent. And as the trapdoor fell, the legend of Wild Bill Longley came to an end. But even in death, the legend refused to stay buried. Within days, rumors began to spread, whispers that the hanging had been faked. Some said the bullets were blanks, that Bill's family bribed the sheriff, that he'd been secretly set free and was living somewhere in Mexico under another name. Others swore they'd seen him years later, older, still smiling that same wicked smile. Historians would later prove the truth. Bill Longley did die on that gallows in Giddings, Texas. His body was buried nearby, and the myth grew stronger with each retelling. In death, he finally got what he always wanted, to be remembered. But what did he really leave behind? Not riches, not glory, just a trail of graves, a few yellowed newspaper pages, and a warning carved into Texas history. Pride and violence never end well. Wild Bill Longley had lived fast, died young, and become a ghost that the West still talks about. He wanted to be a hero. He became a legend of regret instead. The old courthouse in Giddings, Texas had never seen a crowd like this before. Men leaned on fence rails, whispering. Women stood in groups, curious but cautious. Children peered through open windows, trying to see the face of the man who had lived like a shadow and killed like a storm. That man was Wild Bill Longley, and for the first time in his wild life, he couldn't run. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. The walls seemed to hold their breath. Longley sat straight, his wrists bound in chains, his eyes restless but proud. He wasn't wearing a gun now, but somehow, he still carried that dangerous energy, the same spark that had once made men step aside when he entered a saloon. Now, those same men watched him like they were looking at a ghost. The trial began on a hot morning in July 1878. The charge, murder in the first degree, the killing of Wilson Anderson, a man from Longley's own hometown. Anderson had once been a friend, even shared Sunday meals with the Longley family. But pride and anger had turned friendship into blood. No one could agree on what started it. Maybe a joke. Maybe an old insult. But they all knew how it ended, with a gunshot, a body on the dirt road, and Bill Longley disappearing into the night. For 3 years, he ran. He rode through swamps, crossed rivers, hid in pine woods and border towns. Every lawman in Texas wanted him. Every stranger who saw him wondered if they'd live to tell it. But at last his luck ran out. And now, the same town that once feared him sat waiting for justice. The witnesses took the stand one by one. They spoke in low voices, about that night, about the anger, about the sound of a gun that echoed like thunder. They spoke of a man consumed by pride who couldn't walk away from a fight. The jury listened. Bill didn't say much. He only stared at the floor, tapping one boot, a small rhythm that only he could hear. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked tired. When the judge asked if he wanted to defend himself, Bill stood slowly. The chains clinked softly, like a sad reminder of the choices behind him. He said quietly, "Gentlemen, I ain't asking for pity. I've lived hard and I've done wrong. I never killed for pleasure, but I did kill for pride. I thought it made me a man. It didn't. It made me a fool." The courtroom fell silent. Even the flies stopped buzzing for a moment. It was the first time the town had heard Wild Bill Longley sound human. After 3 days of testimony, the jury left the room. The crowd waited, whispering prayers, gossip, and bets. It didn't take long. When the jury came back, the foreman's voice trembled as he spoke one word: guilty. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, murmurs. Bill sat still, his jaw tight, his hands trembling slightly in his cuffs. The judge's voice echoed through the wooden hall. "The court sentences you, William Preston Longley, to be hanged by the neck until dead." Outside, the sun was already setting, but for Bill, the world had gone dark. In the weeks that followed, the jail became his world. A small square room with one window, a cot, and a Bible. He wrote letters to his parents, to old friends, to anyone who might still care. Some said he asked for forgiveness. Others said he was still joking with guards, saying, "Don't worry, ropes never hold me long." People believed him. He had escaped before. He'd faked death once, and the rumor was he could do it again. Even the lawmen weren't sure. Was this really the end of Wild Bill Longley? On the morning of October 11th, 1878, Giddings woke early. The gallows stood tall in the town square, built with rough wood and cold nails. By sunrise, hundreds of people had gathered. They came from miles away, some for justice, others just for the spectacle. Everyone wanted to say they'd seen it happen. When the sheriff brought him out, Bill was calm. He wore clean clothes, his hair brushed back. He walked slowly, nodding to faces he recognized. Some said he smiled. Others swore he whispered a prayer. At the foot of the gallows, he paused. The preacher stepped forward, offering words of mercy. Bill nodded, eyes distant, as if already somewhere far away. When asked if he had final words, he spoke clearly. "I've been a wild man. I've done wrong. But I hope the young men who hear my name will learn from it. Don't take up the gun unless you're ready to die by it." I thought fear made me strong. It didn't. It made me alone. The crowd stood in silence. Even the wind stopped for a moment. He climbed the steps. The hangman slipped the rope over his neck. A hush fell over Giddings. For all the noise Bill Longley had made in life, his ending was quiet, a single breath, a drop, and then stillness. Wild Bill Longley was dead. The crowd began to whisper, their voices mixed with awe and disbelief. Some crossed themselves, some turned away, and some swore they'd seen him wink just before the trapdoor fell. A few days later, the rumors started. They said the bullets and the guns were blanks, that his family had bribed the sheriff, that Bill had somehow escaped once more, that he was living in Mexico under a new name. But the truth was simpler. He was buried in a small graveyard just outside town, the dirt still fresh, the legend just beginning. For years after, travelers claimed to see him, in saloons, on dusty roads, at campfires. But those were just stories. The man was gone. What remained was the myth, larger, louder, and more dangerous than he had ever been in life. In the end, Bill Longley became exactly what he wanted to be, remembered. But not for bravery, not for honor, for how easily pride can destroy a man. His name still rides the Texas wind, a warning whispered across time. Wild hearts die fast, and legends never rest easy. When the trapdoor fell in Giddings, Texas, it should have been the end of Wild Bill Longley. But in a strange way, it was only the beginning. The outlaw who once terrified Texas now became a story, whispered in saloons, retold on porches, printed in papers, and sung around campfires. And as with all good stories, each telling made it a little bigger, a little bolder, a little less true. In the weeks after his hanging, rumors spread faster than the prairie wind. Some people said he never died, that the hanging was a trick. They claimed his family paid off the sheriff and that another man had swung from the rope that day. Others swore they'd seen him months later in Mexico, wearing a new name, drinking whiskey in a dusty cantina. Even newspapers couldn't decide what to believe. One article said, "Longley met his end like a man." Another hinted that the famous outlaw has slipped death once again. It didn't matter what was true. The people wanted a legend, and Wild Bill Longley gave them one. Over time, fact and fiction blurred. Historians who studied him later said he killed around 8 men, but by the 1880s, people were saying 32. By the turn of the century, some stories had him facing down whole gangs, a lone gunfighter who could outshoot anyone in Texas. He became a ghost of the frontier, a name to fill the spaces where truth had been lost. Mothers warned their sons, "Don't end up like Wild Bill," and young men whispered his name like a dare. But the real man behind the myth was far from the hero in those stories. He wasn't fighting for justice or freedom. He wasn't a Robin Hood or a brave gunslinger defending the weak. He was angry, reckless, and young, a man shaped by a violent time, yet that didn't stop people from rewriting him. The truth was too sad. The myth was exciting, and America has always loved a good outlaw story. By the early 1900s, the Wild West was fading. The last gunfights were giving way to railroads, newspapers, and motion pictures. But the old outlaws, men like Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Wild Bill Longley, became larger than life. Writers turned them into heroes. Filmmakers turned them into stars, and soon, Longley's name was back in the spotlight. Not as the cruel young killer who hung in Texas, but as a wandering gunfighter with a heart of gold. The truth was being buried again, this time under Hollywood lights. In 1958, the myth reached television. The CBS show The Texan hit screens across America, starring Rory Calhoun as Bill Longley, a tall, handsome drifter with a kind smile and a strong moral code. Every week, millions watched this new Bill Longley ride from town to town, defending the innocent, fighting injustice, and doing good wherever he went. It was entertainment, not history. But it worked. The audience loved him. The real Wild Bill would have laughed, or maybe he'd have been proud. After all, that's what he'd wanted all along, to be remembered. The TV Bill Longley wore clean clothes, spoke softly, and always did the right thing. The real Bill Longley wore anger like a second skin. He made his choices in a world that didn't forgive mistakes, and he paid for every one of them. But to the public, the difference didn't matter. The name was enough. The legend had finally erased the man. Historians began digging deeper in the years that followed. Old court records, letters, witness statements. They began to separate myth from memory. They found the truth that the dime novels had buried. Bill Longley wasn't a hero. He was a warning, a product of hate, pride, and the chaos that ruled Texas after the Civil War. He was proof that violence always comes back to claim its own. And yet his story kept being told, not because of who he was, but because of what people wanted him to be. Even now, more than a century later, his grave still draws visitors. It's a simple headstone in Lee County, surrounded by grass and silence. There's no statue, no monument, just a name carved in stone. William Preston Longley, born 1851, died 1878. Tourists leave coins, flowers, even small notes. Some thank him for his story. Others say they hope his soul found peace. A few just stare at the ground and wonder, was he really that bad, or just a man who never had a chance? In truth, maybe he was both. A killer, yes, but also a kid who grew up in a broken world. One that taught him that fear was strength and pride was honor. He learned too late that those lessons lead only one way, to the gallows. And yet the story of Bill Longley refuses to die. Because deep down, people see a reflection of themselves, the fight between good and bad, between pride and regret, between who we are and who we pretend to be. So when you hear the name Wild Bill Longley, remember this: the legend was built on lies, but the truth was real and tragic. He wanted to be remembered forever, and he got his wish. But not as a hero, as a warning, a reminder that the loudest lives often end in silence. The wind still blows across his grave in Texas. It hums through the grass like a whisper, carrying his story from one century to the next. And if you listen close, you can almost hear it say, "The wild die fast," but their stories live forever. For almost 100 years, Wild Bill Longley lived louder in legend than he ever did in life. People told stories of a man faster than any gun, braver than any lawman, and too wild for any rope. But when historians began digging into his real story, they found something very different. They found a man, not a hero, not even a mastermind, but a troubled soul born into chaos. The first real research into Longley's life began in the early 1900s. Texas historians started reading through court papers, family letters, and prison records. What they uncovered shattered almost every myth. They discovered that Bill hadn't killed 30 men, or even 20. Most of the deaths he bragged about never happened at all. He had been a storyteller, a man who made himself famous through his own lies, and in a strange way, that made his story even sadder. The truth was that Bill Longley grew up during one of the hardest times in Texas history. The Civil War had left the state poor, divided, and lawless. Violence wasn't the exception. It was the rule. Young men grew up thinking that carrying a gun meant power, and power meant survival. Bill was one of them. He wasn't born evil. He was shaped by the violence around him, by a world that taught him to strike first or die trying. His story was not about glory. It was about a boy who never learned peace. Historians also found that Longley wasn't the fearless Lone Ranger that the myths described. He was impulsive, insecure, and easily angered. Many of his killings started as small arguments, over cards, insults, or pride. He often shot men who were unarmed. Some of his victims weren't even enemies. They were old friends, neighbors, or people who simply said the wrong thing. The records show he killed at least 8 people, possibly a few more. But even those deaths were not legendary gunfights under the open sky. They were quick, messy, and cruel. When historians compared eyewitness accounts, they found another truth. Longley liked to exaggerate everything. He told tall tales about escaping death, surviving gunfights, and being hunted by hundreds of men. In reality, most of his escapes were either helped by friends or happened because the law was slow to travel across Texas. The Rangers caught up with him several times, and when they finally did, he surrendered without a fight. He wasn't the fearless outlaw he pretended to be. He was a man running from his own reputation. The deeper researchers looked, the more contradictions they found. Old newspapers showed that many stories printed about him were completely made up, invented by editors who wanted to sell more papers. They painted him as a wild, charming gunfighter who laughed in the face of danger. In truth, Longley spent much of his life hiding, hungry, and scared. He was clever, yes, but not untouchable. And when the end came in 1878, he didn't die in a blaze of glory. He died quietly, a young man barely 27, with more regrets than riches. For historians, the real turning point came when they found Longley's own letters, written from his jail cell in Giddings before his execution. In those letters, his voice sounded different. He wasn't boasting anymore. He was remorseful, tired, and honest. He wrote to his parents that he had wasted his life chasing pride. He wrote to friends asking for forgiveness. He even thanked the sheriff who treated him kindly in his final days. One letter ended with these words, "Tell the boys not to take my path. It leads only one way, to this rope around my neck." Those words, historians say, are the closest thing we have to the real Wild Bill Longley. Not the outlaw, but the broken man who finally saw the truth too late. As time passed, researchers compared the myth with the facts. The myth said Longley was a quick-draw champion, but no evidence showed he ever fought a fair duel. The myth said he escaped death dozens of times, but the records show he was lucky, not magical. The myth said he was fearless, but his own writings show he was afraid of dying. Even as he faced it, all that remained real were the deaths, the pride, and the silence that followed him to the grave. Even today, historians argue about who Bill Longley really was. Some say he was a reflection of his time, a violent young man shaped by a violent land. Others say he was a warning, a symbol of what happens when pride and revenge become stronger than reason. But everyone agrees on one thing: he was human, flawed, wild, and tragically young. If Bill Longley had been born in another time, in a world with peace, schools, and hope, maybe he could have been something else. A storyteller, a soldier, a rancher, maybe even a preacher like his father wanted. But fate gave him the gun instead of a pen, and he wrote his story in blood. The truth doesn't make him a hero, but it makes him real. And maybe that's worth more than the legend ever was. The last mystery left behind by Bill Longley isn't about how he died. It's about why his story still matters. Because behind every outlaw tale, there's a lesson, a mirror showing how pride, anger, and fear can twist a man's life beyond repair. The Wild West made legends out of killers, but history turns them back into people. And that's where the truth of Wild Bill Longley lives. Not in the gun smoke, not in the myth, but in the quiet confession of a man who finally saw himself clearly, just before the rope went tight. When Wild Bill Longley swung from the gallows in 1878, most people thought his story was over. But Texas has a strange way of keeping its ghosts alive. And Bill's ghost, restless, proud, and loud, refused to stay buried. In death, he became more than a man. He became a lesson, a warning, and a mirror reflecting the darker side of the Old West. In the years after his hanging, Texas was changing fast. The wide-open prairies were turning into farms. Railroads were carving through the wildlands. And law, real law, was finally spreading across the frontier. But behind every courthouse and every sheriff's badge was a story like Bill Longley's. Stories of men who lived too fast, fought too hard, and paid too dearly. The government wanted order. The people wanted peace. And both knew that outlaws like Longley were the reason Texas learned the price of lawlessness. Historians later said that Bill Longley's crimes helped shape early Texas justice. In the 1870s, trials were rare and hangings were often swift and public. But Longley's case was different. His trial was recorded, witnessed, and judged by the books. It became a symbol, proof that even the most feared gunman could be caught, tried, and executed by the law. It was one of the first times the Texas Rangers had successfully hunted down a man who seemed untouchable. And it showed that the era of the lawless West was finally coming to an end, but his influence didn't stop there. Bill Longley became the model for a new kind of outlaw story, the kind that mixed fear with fascination. Writers used his name to sell newspapers. Preachers used his story to warn young men about the dangers of pride. Parents used it to scare their children into staying out of trouble. Don't end up like Wild Bill Longley, they'd say. And for a generation, that warning worked. Yet there was something magnetic about him. People couldn't look away. They called him evil, but they also admired his courage. He was reckless, but he was brave. He was cruel, but he was alive in a way most people only dreamed of. That's the curse of a legend. It refuses to stay simple. And in time, people began to forget the real blood behind his name. They remembered only the thrill, the danger, the story. In the 1950s, when Hollywood came calling, that story changed forever. Television turned Wild Bill Longley into something else entirely, a hero. On CBS's The Texan, actor Rory Calhoun played Bill as a wandering gunfighter with a strong moral code, a man who helped others and stood up for justice. It was a beautiful lie, and it worked perfectly. Families across America watched every week as this Wild Bill saved towns, defended the innocent, and rode off into the sunset. The show was clean, simple, and full of hope. Everything the real Bill Longley wasn't. The outlaw had finally become the Hollywood cowboy. But even as the TV version rode tall, Texas historians were quietly doing their work. They dug into archives, tracked down old letters, and pieced together the real man behind the myth. And the more they uncovered, the more human he became. They found evidence of a young man who laughed easily, who could charm anyone, who once wrote poems for a girl he loved. They also found proof of deep anger, loneliness, and guilt, emotions that never made it to television. The truth was not heroic. It was tragic, and that's what made it matter. Today, Wild Bill Longley's story sits at the crossroads of myth and history. In school books, he's a small name in the long list of Texas outlaws. In museums, his face appears on faded wanted posters. In books, he's both villain and victim, a man who became a legend for all the wrong reasons. But if you visit his hometown, you'll find something quieter, a kind of respect, not for what he did, but for what his story taught. that no matter how wild the frontier, law and consequence always catch up, and that no man, no matter how fast or feared, can outrun his own choices. In a strange way, Bill Longley helped Texas grow up. He showed what happened when pride replaced honor, when violence replaced justice, and when stories became more powerful than truth. Because of him and men like him, Texas learned to value law over revenge. It learned that legends fade, but the lessons they leave behind don't. His grave still stands in Lee County, beneath a simple headstone that reads his name. No statues, no fancy memorial, just grass, sky, and the quiet sound of wind through the trees. People still visit, leaving coins or notes. Some come to pay respect to the outlaw. Others come to see the history he helped shape. And if you stand there long enough with the Texas sun setting low, you might understand why his story still echoes. Because Wild Bill Longley was not just one man. He was a symbol of everything the West was. Brave, violent, untamed, and unforgettable. In the end, his legacy isn't in the number of men he killed or the lies he told. It's in the way his life forced a young Texas to look in the mirror, to see the cost of chaos, to understand the need for order, and to realize that every legend begins and ends with truth. He once said, "I was born for trouble, and trouble's where I'll die." And he was right. But what he couldn't know was that his trouble would change Texas forever. His story became a line in history, the line between the wild frontier and the rule of law. When Wild Bill Longley met his end in 1878, a chapter of Texas history quietly closed. The age of the lone outlaw, the gunslinger who ruled the prairie by fear and fire, was fading. Texas was tired of chaos. It wanted something new, something lasting. It wanted law, order, and identity. The wild frontier was finally beginning to grow up. For decades, Texas had been known as the land where men carried guns instead of answers. From cattle thieves to stagecoach robbers, violence had shaped its every corner. But after the deaths of outlaws like Longley, public hunger for justice began to change everything. People no longer wanted to cheer for killers. They wanted to build towns, schools, and a future. The same places that once worshipped the gun began to respect the gavel. And the same dusty trails where outlaws once rode became the streets of new rising cities. The Texas Rangers, who once chased men like Longley through deserts and woods, also changed. They became smarter, more organized, more respected. They stopped being just trackers and gunmen. They became symbols of the new Texas law. By the 1880s, the Rangers had modernized their ranks. They worked with judges, marshals, and communities to build trust instead of fear. No longer were they just the men with six-shooters. They were the backbone of Texas justice. And it was men like Bill Longley who had shown them why that transformation was necessary. The newspapers, too, began to shift their tone. Where once they had glorified outlaws, now they celebrated lawmen. Sheriffs became heroes. Rangers were praised for bravery instead of bloodshed. And new names, men like Captain Leander McNelly and John B. Armstrong, replaced the old legends. Texas was no longer the land of the hunted. It was becoming the land of the governed. But the road to peace wasn't easy. For years, many Texans still carried the old pride, the same fire that burned in Longley. They saw laws as chains and freedom as a gun belt. It took time, patience, and courage to tame that spirit. And even then, the past never completely vanished. Some still told stories of the old days, when a man could take justice into his own hands. They remembered it fondly, forgetting the fear that had once come with it. Because time has a way of polishing even the roughest stones. By the late 19th century, the frontier was disappearing. Railroads cut through the wilderness, connecting towns and cities. Telegraphs carried news faster than horses ever could. Cattle drives became industry. And Texas, once a wild borderland, turned into the beating heart of the new American West. But even as progress marched forward, the old legends refused to die. The stories of outlaws like Longley, Billy the Kid, and Jesse James lived on in dime novels, plays, and campfire songs. They became entertainment, safe, distant, romantic. The truth was ugly, but the myth was beautiful, and people always preferred a beautiful story. In classrooms, teachers began to teach both sides. They spoke of courage and chaos, of rebellion and reform. Students learned about how Texas earned its nickname, the Lone Star State. Not just through war, but through resilience. It had survived its wild years, and it had learned from them. Longley and men like him were now cautionary tales, warnings written into Texas history books. This is what happens when pride outruns mercy. As the 20th century dawned, Texas became a new kind of legend. No longer the land of fugitives and gunmen, now it was the land of ranchers, oilmen, and dreamers. The same soil that had soaked in the blood of outlaws now produced wealth, progress, and innovation. Skylines replaced saloons. Courtrooms replaced gallows, and the pistol gave way to the pen. Still, the wildness never vanished completely. It lingered in the people, in their independence, their toughness, their refusal to quit. That spirit came from the same soil that raised men like Bill Longley. But now it was guided by purpose instead of pride. It was the new Texas courage, strong but disciplined, free but fair. Historians often say that the end of the outlaws was the beginning of Texas identity, because it was in those hard lessons, in the chaos, the killings, and the consequences, that the state discovered who it really was, a place that valued freedom, yes, but also justice, a place that honored bravery, but not cruelty, and a place that never forgot its past, even as it built a better future. If you drive through Texas today, you'll still see signs of that transformation. Old wooden jailhouses standing beside modern courthouses, statues of rangers watching over bustling cities, and sometimes, if you listen to the stories told in small-town museums, you'll hear the old names whispered again, names like Longley, Hardin, and Bonnie and Clyde. Ghosts of a time when Texas was still learning what kind of place it wanted to be. The legend of Wild Bill Longley didn't die with him. It became part of Texas itself, a reminder carved into the heart of the Lone Star State, because his life, with all its fire and failure, forced Texas to ask one question: what does it mean to be free? And what's the cost of that freedom? And the answer, written through time, was this: freedom without law is chaos, and law without mercy is tyranny. Texas had to find the balance, and in the shadow of men like Longley, it finally did. The gunslinger was gone, but his echo shaped the land he left behind, a land that rose from the dust to become a symbol of strength, pride, and redemption. From lawless plains to the Lone Star, Texas had finally tamed its own legend. The wild men of Texas once ruled the open plains with guns and grit. They rode through dust storms, lived by their own laws, and died by their own hands. But time has a way of silencing even the loudest legends. Today their voices rest beneath the dirt, quiet, still, and almost forgotten. And among those forgotten graves lies one name that refuses to disappear: Wild Bill Longley. In a small cemetery outside Giddings, Texas, stands a weathered headstone. It's not grand, not decorated, not fenced or guarded. Just a piece of gray stone tilted slightly by years of wind and rain. The inscription is simple: William Preston Longley, born 1851, died 1878. If you didn't know the story, you'd walk right past it. But for those who do, that quiet grave holds a storm. Locals say the cemetery gets visitors from all over: historians, tourists, even old Texans tracing their roots. Some leave coins, some leave whiskey bottles. A few leave handwritten notes that say things like, "Rest easy, Wild Bill." Others leave nothing but silence, standing there in thought. They don't come to honor him. They come to remember what his story meant, a lesson carved into the soil of Texas. Not far from Longley's grave lie others, men who once shared his world. Killers, cowhands, lawmen, and drifters who all became part of the same dust. Some died by rope, some by bullets, some by time itself. But their graves tell the same truth: the wild never lasts. There's John Wesley Hardin buried in El Paso, another gunman with a quick hand and a slower soul. And Sam Bass, the train robber from Denton, shot down before he turned 30. They, like Longley, became legends too, not because of what they built, but because of how loudly they burned. When you visit these graves, you notice something strange. None of them look powerful anymore. The wind has worn down the stone. The weeds grow tall. The noise of their lives is gone, replaced by the hum of cicadas and the whisper of history. It makes you think, how much of a man really survives after death? Is it his deeds, his name, or just the stories people keep telling long after he's gone? For Texas, these graves are more than burial sites. They are markers of transformation, reminders of a time when the law was learning to walk, when justice came on horseback, and when freedom and chaos were twins. Each outlaw's grave is a page in a bigger story. The story of how a wild land became a state, how fear became order, and how even the most violent men ended up teaching peace by the way they fell. Over the years, towns have tried to forget the blood and remember the lessons. Museums display rusted guns and wanted posters behind glass, labeled not with pride, but with perspective. Old gallows are rebuilt as history exhibits, and school children visit them not to glorify violence, but to understand the cost of it. The same Texas that once raised men like Longley now teaches his story as a warning, a reminder that fame without honor means nothing, but not everyone sees it that way. Some visitors still look at those names with admiration. They say those men were free. They answered to no one. Maybe they're right, in a way, but freedom without purpose is just another kind of prison. And that's what these graves truly represent. Men who were free for a moment, and lost everything forever. Late in the evenings, when the Texas sun drops low and the sky turns red, the cemeteries grow quiet again. The wind rolls over the graves, carrying with it whispers of the past. Some say if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear their voices. Proud, regretful, unrepentant. You can almost hear Bill Longley saying, "Tell them I wasn't all bad. I just didn't know how to stop." Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's guilt carried by the land itself. But one thing is certain. Texas never forgets its ghosts. Every town has one. Every rancher, every sheriff, every road seems to have a story about someone who lived too fast and died too young. The state is full of markers, small signs that read, "Site of the hanging tree," "Last gunfight in town," "Resting place of the outlaw." Each one is a reminder of how close the past still lingers. The outlaws are gone, but their shadows walk beside Texas still. And maybe that's what keeps people coming to those lonely graves. Not curiosity, but connection. Because deep down, every person who stands over that old headstone wonders the same thing. What would I have done, living in a world with no rules? It's a haunting thought, one that ties the present to the past, and that's why the legends still breathe, even from under the ground. The grave of Wild Bill Longley isn't grand, but it doesn't have to be. His story is written across the entire state, in its laws, its people, its spirit. He's part of the land now, part of the long, dusty song that Texas still sings about freedom, danger, and redemption as the wind blows softly over the cemetery. The final truth of the outlaw's life becomes clear. Legends may die, but they never really leave. They become part of the soil, part of the story, part of the soul of the place they shaped. And as night falls over the Texas hills, it feels like the land itself is whispering, "Sleep, Wild Bill. Your story's been told." The wind never really stops in Texas. It moves through the hills, across the plains, and over the old cemeteries, carrying stories from another time. Stories of men who lived fast, fought hard, and paid dearly. Among them, one name still whispers through that wind: Bill, Wild Bill Longley. More than a century has passed since the rope tightened around his neck. The world has changed, the land has changed, but the questions his life left behind still hang in the air. Why do men chase danger? Why do we mistake fear for power? And why do we remember those who destroy more than those who build? Maybe it's because the story of Wild Bill Longley isn't just about one outlaw. It's about all of us, our pride, our anger, our longing to be remembered. Bill Longley wanted to be someone. He grew up poor, in a world where respect was earned at the barrel of a gun. He believed that to be feared was to be free, that the louder you shouted, the less the world could hurt you. But behind the gunfire and the bravado was a lonely truth. He was just a boy who didn't know how to be seen any other way. Every legend begins with a wound. For Longley, that wound was pride, sharp, deep, and unhealed. He couldn't walk away from an insult. He couldn't admit when he was wrong. And every time he reached for his gun, he thought he was proving his strength, when all he was proving was how much fear ruled his heart. That's the hidden tragedy of men like him. They build a name out of noise, but when the noise fades, there's nothing left but silence. When he finally faced death, Longley saw that truth. The words he spoke before the gallows weren't defiant. They were tired, honest, human. He told the crowd, "I thought fear made me strong. It didn't. It made me alone." Those words outlived him. They became the final echo of a life that had burned too bright and too brief. And that's why his story still matters. Because beneath the myth, beneath the gunfights and the outlaw tales, there's a message that never grows old. Pride can destroy faster than any bullet. Anger can turn any man into his own worst enemy. And forgiveness, of others and of yourself, is the only thing that truly sets you free. Bill Longley's name once made Texas tremble. Now it makes people reflect. He's no longer the face of rebellion. He's the symbol of a warning. A reminder that power without purpose leads only to emptiness, and that the toughest battles are not fought in dusty streets. They're fought inside the human heart. When you strip away the legend, what remains is simple. A young man born into violence who never learned another way to live. His story is not about glory. It's about what happens when a man confuses respect with fear. It's about how easily pride can blind us, how quickly anger can own us, and how even the fiercest spirit can fall. But it's also about redemption. Not the kind you find in books or movies, but the quiet kind. The kind that lives in a few last words, a final prayer, and a single moment of truth before the end. In many ways, Wild Bill Longley's story is the story of the West itself. Wild, violent, misunderstood, and searching for peace. He was one of many who walked that dangerous path, but his fall helped Texas, and America, realize that legends built on blood don't last forever. The guns fell silent, the law took hold, and from the ashes of men like Longley, the West grew wiser. Even now, people still visit his grave. They stand in the Texas sun, listening to the wind through the grass. Some come for history, some come for curiosity, but a few come for understanding. They look down at that simple stone and think about the choices that make a life, the pride, the anger, the moments we can't take back. And they realize something powerful, that every one of us walks the same line between good and bad. Pride and humility, chaos and peace. Longley just walked it louder. So, what does the life of Wild Bill Longley teach us? That the wild in every man must be tamed, not by fear, not by force, but by wisdom. That freedom without conscience becomes destruction. And that the strongest people are not those who win fights, but those who learn to stop fighting themselves. That's the truth the myth never told. That's the lesson the outlaw left behind. In the end, Bill Longley got what he wanted. He was remembered. But not for his guns, not for his kills. He was remembered for his warning. And maybe that's the most powerful kind of immortality, to serve as a mirror for the rest of us, so that we don't make the same mistakes. As the Texas wind drifts across his grave, it carries the soft hum of an old lesson. Every man is born wild. What matters is what he chooses to do with that wildness. And in that echo, the story of Wild Bill Longley lives on, not as a tale of glory, but as a reminder that even the wildest hearts seek peace at the end. You've just heard the true story of Wild Bill Longley, the outlaw who mistook fear for fame and left behind a legend built on lessons. If you believe stories like this still matter, hit subscribe, share this journey, and join us next time as we uncover more true tales of history, raw, real, and unforgettable.